recall
set up concentration camps.
When this was brought up in the Iran-Contra hearings, remember? They immediately suppressed it, and they say, this is something we can't discuss in the open. The people aren't allowed to know about this. And that's why, who protected this information? Who protected Oliver North? The head Democrat, which goes to show you the power structure is the same.
John, you made a big study of the history of the Federal Reserve. How did it come about?
Well, it's a murky story, and I think that maybe 1913 ought to be the year that went down in infamy in American history, because not only did we get just barely in 1913 the Federal Reserve, we also got the income tax in that very same year, and those two things have worked to our really been a very negative thing in our society and in our economy ever since that time. But it was a very secretive thing. It really goes back to the bankers getting in a sealed railway car and sneaking off to Jekyll Island, Georgia. And it was a very secret meeting. In fact, they called it the First Name Club. They only called each other by their first names, so that even people who worked there as waiters and servants and so forth later couldn't identify for sure who had even participated in that meeting.
It was only about 4 or 5 people, wasn't it?
Well, it was about 10, I believe, or 12. And that group of people literally laid the basis for what became the Federal Reserve.
Basically Rockefeller, Morgan people?
That group, you probably know something in that area.
Colonel House was involved there, and the Woodrow Wilson people were there, although this occurred, I believe, in 1910 or so when they met at Jekyll Island.
Yes, that's right. It was a couple of years later.
By the time it got planned, it was finally passed in 1913.
It was kind of sneaked through Congress, and Wilson actually signed that into law, the Federal Reserve Act, like 2 days before Christmas. And when many of the senators and congressmen, of course with transportation in 1913 being what it was, they had long since left the nation capital, many of them, but the ones that they wanted to stay and vote did stay and vote. Wilson signed the law 2 days before Christmas, and traditionally hasn't that been a period where by gentleman's agreement that important legislation is not enacted right around the Christmas holiday?
It may be a gentleman's agreement, but that's generally the time that I was always most vigilant, because I realized that's when most of the garbage would be passed and most of the more onerous. You know, on the last day of the session is unbelievable. Stacks and stacks of pieces of legislation come in, and nobody reads anything. So the worst things happen at a particular time, but it is supposed to be that if the members aren't attending, that they wouldn't be doing these kind of things. But you're absolutely right. There was a very low attendance, and it was an unusual year, because generally Congress didn't meet that late in the year, and I don't know whether they were called back into session what, but it was unusual for Congress back in those days. Now it's very common to meet all year round. So back then they were usually only in session 2 or 3 months of the year, but here they were in session in December. Very unusual year.
Well, of course, now we've talked about government and corporations. But as you've said, up at the top, they're all the same people. The corporate executives go to and from the government. They hold positions in the government. The people from the Trilateral Commission and the Bilderbergers and all, they're all corporate people. And they have their relationships and interlocks with the banks and with universities and foundations and all that. So to talk about you're really talking about one source of power instead of corporation on one side and government on the other, because it's all one pot, as you said.
I think it's become one pot. Not only that is you don't have any help by, say, voting for a Democrat who may be a little more critical of large corporations. But we know Democrats are just as much in bed with big government, too. I mean, you take a Michael Dukakis, for instance. Do you think maybe Boston was somewhat dependent on some military contracts with Tip O'Neill? I mean, they're just as much. It's all demagoguery when it comes to these political campaigns. So either side, they're the same people control it. And, you know, Ronald Reagan spoke sharply against the Trilateral Commission, but he was the first president to host the Trilateral Commission in the White House. I mean, that's how blatant it is. It's the same group of people. That's why you find no political action committee, no large corporation who supports libertarians. I voted while in Congress, I think the strictest free market set of votes ever. But I never got political action committee money. But small business people who want to compete against big business, they're free market people, and they're much more likely to be libertarians and believe in the principles of free enterprise. But once the corporations get real large, and they're more interested in paying a couple $100,000 for a top lobbyist who knows the system, who can get a regulation that exempts their corporation or gets their contract in place. And this is the way the system works. So we reward the lobbyists and the political action committees much more so than we reward a principle of freedom.
What about this Banking and Currency Committee? And we've had Congressman Gonzalez on, who's one of your colleagues, and he sees the world very clearly and sees the power structures at work. And I'm sure you have a clear picture of this also. Is this one of the reasons you became a libertarian instead of a Republican?
Well, it's certainly one of the reasons why I got involved in politics, because I was very fascinated with economics and particularly monetary policy. And if you think about it, money is pretty important. If you look at all transactions, whether you're buying something or selling your services, 1/2 of all economic transactions is the monetary unit. So if somebody has control over the value of the monetary unit, they control every transaction. Therefore, if you have an institution, such as a government-ordained bank, like a central bank, like our Federal Reserve, if they have absolute monopoly control over the value of that currency, they control everything in the economy. It becomes a form of a government-regulated economy. It doesn't become socialism, but the money obviously is socialistic in that the government controls it. So if they increase the supply, the value goes down. If they tighten the supply, interest rates go up. So it's tremendous economic power. And the insiders, those who know what the policy is, literally can benefit. They don't stuff their pockets and line their pockets with cash. That's not the way it happens. But those who are in the inside and knowledgeable will benefit because they know which direction interest rates are going and which way the economy is going. And if you look at the members of the Federal Reserve, you find out that they don't ask people like me to be on the Federal Reserve, even though I've had experience on studying the issue and been on the banking committee. They ask only the people who are casually referred to as the insiders, those from Wall Street and the banking industry, the Paul Volckers and the Alan Greenspans of the world. They're on the inside. They know how to deal with the establishment, and they get these positions, and therefore it is a tremendous amount of economic power falls into the hands of what we call the Open Market Committee, the Federal Open Market Committee. They control from day to day the supply of money. They become the legal counterfeiters. You know, if you and I had control of the printing press, we could do a lot of things, you know, self-serving. That's what happens when the politicians create the central bank that control the money.
Now, this control of the central bank and the money goes on regardless of which party is in power, right?
It never changes. You know, they change a person here and there, but it's always the insiders. It's always from the same group. So if you have a Republican as president or the Democrats, they're going to get the same appointments. Appointments never change. And this can be said about the Secretary of State and the Secretary of Defense and the Secretary of Treasury and the Federal Reserve Board members. They all come from the same group. And even though, I guess naively, I was hopeful that the same group of individuals would not have as much power under Ronald Reagan. But, you know, I was there, I witnessed it, and of course that led to my disenchantment, my disappointment, enough to the point where I just said, I've had enough, and then I left the Republican Party and joined the Libertarian Party with the idea that you cannot trust Republicans to be independent of the system either, although Ronald Reagan led us to believe that he would be independent.
To go to the Libertarian presidential candidate?
Yes, I think we deserve a minute on what you indicate. You said if the Libertarians in charge, there would be no America. Clearly, let me challenge some of you who may be even leaning toward the conservative philosophy. Ask me why we still finance the communists. Ask me why 70% of the military budget is spent overseas. Ask me why the good airplanes are overseas and the lousy airplanes are not here. The lousy airplanes are in the Air National Guard. I would say clean out the State Department, spend more money on our national defense, have an anti-communist policy. Don't sign these treaties with the Soviets. Don't extend loans to the Soviet Union. And not to fight these wars with the funds we raise from the illegal drugs. So under the libertarian society, no, we don't fight Vietnam wars, we don't fight the Korean wars, we fight wars to defend America and we get high on the ideas of freedom. We get high because freedom and liberty is worth it. Let me answer that. Just say no. Assume the responsibility of yourself. Don't assume the government makes your decisions. You say no.
I think I detect his voice changing. Maybe his cojones are getting small.
You are living in a pipe dream. You don't know anything about what goes on out in the streets. I'm a drug counselor. I see people every day who have lived their lives with drugs. Who do you know that's on drugs? No, you are the failure, my man. You are the failure, my man. Because you are a bunch of idiots sitting up in a glass enclosed office making decisions.
Let the other man come up. Let everyone have a shot. Come on. Everyone gets a shot. Come on up here, pal. Go ahead.
I'm sorry. This woman is calling a libertarian someone who's for economic and personal liberty an idiot. This woman's for alcohol prohibition. She wants to bring back alcohol. She wants all the problems associated with alcohol prohibition back again.
Does she believe in the Constitution?
I don't think she does. I mean, we have current drug policy.
I'm tired of all of you pro-legalization drug people hiding behind the Constitution.
Come on, you haven't said this. I'll address you. I'm somebody who has a father who was a junkie, who has a sister who was a junkie. I'm somebody who lives on 9th Street and Avenue C. I have gone into crack houses and everything else with baseball bats. I've run out murderers and rapists and thieves. And I'm here to tell you, coming off the streets, the only reason that these murderers, rapists, and thieves exist is because these legalizing people allow the Gambinos and the Gottis to sell drugs, and they don't allow it to be sold by the Lilly Corporation and by the people who the blood of American children are on all of your heads.
I got 3 quick questions.
3.
Okay, 4 actually. 4.
You can remember.
Now,
You can remember.
I want to say something.
It's the same.
John, you made a big study of the history of the Federal Reserve. How did it come about?
Well, it's a murky story, and I think that maybe 1913 ought to be the year that went down in infamy in American history, because not only did we get just barely in 1913 the Federal Reserve, we also got the income tax in that very same year, and those two things have worked to our really been a very negative thing in our society and in our economy ever since that time. But it was a very secretive thing. It really goes back to the bankers getting in a sealed railway car and sneaking off to Jekyll Island, Georgia. And it was a very secret meeting. In fact, they called it the First Name Club. They only called each other by their first name. That group, you probably know something in that area.
Colonel House was involved there, and the Woodrow Wilson people were there, although this occurred, I believe, in 1910 or so when they met at Jekyll Island.
Yes, that's right. It was a couple of years later.
By the time it got planned, it was finally passed in 1913.
It was kind of sneaked through Congress, and Wilson actually signed that.
Set up concentration camps.
Well, this was brought up in the Iran-Contra hearings, remember? They immediately suppressed it, and they say, this is something we can't discuss in the open.
Yes.
People weren't allowed to know about this. And that's why. Who protected this information? Who protected Oliver North? The head Democrat. which goes to show you the power structure.
So that even people who worked there as waiters and servants and so forth later couldn't identify for sure who had even participated in that meeting.
It was only about 4 or 5 people, wasn't it?
Well, it was about 10, I believe, or 12, and that group of people literally laid the basis for what became the Federal Reserve.
Basically Rockefeller, Morgan people.